Hello, Sentinels. Oh, sorry, it's very late. I don't like doing these at night, but unfortunately the guys have finished the heating, but it's freezing in here during the day. So I will be getting back to doing these during the day fairly soon. And maybe I will be then somewhat more coherent. So I'd like to ask you a question in episode 28. And that would be, do you believe what doctors say or neuroscientists have been saying for the last few years, that the brain basically is not evolving the way that, for example, technology is? Seems a fair enough statement. Also seems fairly obvious that the brain, the basic operating system, hasn't changed. So what's your answer to that? Fairly, I would have thought, for most of you, you'd say, okay, our brains haven't changed. But it's only since 1995 when modern neuroscience has actually been able to look inside your brains and see what's happening when it is actually occurring, that they've made any progress. So it's only in the last sort of 15 years that they've made any real progress. And I just wonder, I'm asking myself this question after looking at the last sort of 2 years of investigation into this, is, are we looking at it too, well, not simplistically enough? Our medicine is based on treating symptoms very often, rather than looking at the whole body. That means the simple fact that we, for example, that 90% of our body is actually not human. It's basically, it's bugs and microbes, or what they now call the microbiome, and that we have 3 brains, for example. You know, one is a cat, one is a rat, and the other's the one that we've got here. So your guts, your heart, and your head. And you know, the gut has like 100 million neurons. That means it functions on its own. If you cut the vagus nerve between the head and the gut, it still functions. And a lot of what we consider to be our feelings come from our guts, which sort of fits, because guts is probably the first thing they had. You've got to digest stuff to be able to actually live. So it doesn't matter what sort of organism you are, you start with a mouth and a gut. And we've got that, and it's the oldest part. It can't necessarily talk to us apart from through the sensory inputs that it provides. It doesn't have a voice, but it's something that we use. Now, I just wondered, if you look at the whole thing, and we look at human beings, and we know now that, for example, for ADHD, the brain itself functions differently. I wonder whether all the different disorders that we've got now, that means ADHD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, whatever they happen to be, you know, whether they're mental illnesses, or they call them mental illnesses. I mean, when you look at it, everything is on a bell curve. So there's the extremes where it's impairing somebody's life, judgment, health, and sanity. And then there's, you know, the major chunk of us where we lie somewhere in between that scale. But I wonder whether that is actually nature's way of saying, right, okay, yeah, everybody's, depending on the disorder, their brains are functioning differently. That means their operating systems for creating their consciousness is different. So, for example, I grew up with a friend of mine. He's bipolar, or he was at the particular point in time, and he's a brilliant guy. You know, it was amazing. Wrote poetry, played guitar. Absolutely incredibly creative person, but without the bipolar part, that means the hyper ups and the massive downs, I don't think he would have produced and done what he's done. Now, there's plenty of people that are bipolar, Mariah Carey, Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, Hemingway, John Nash? Yes, John Nash. And without that, John Nash, by the way, is the guy that Russell, what's his name? God, forgotten. He played. He's a mathematician, and basically he was very influential. And he had schizophrenia, as it turns out. Sorry, and he couldn't do his math when he took the medication. And I don't take any medication for ADHD. I presume that if you get to the extreme level, so that you've got to take some sort of medication, that means otherwise you're going to hurt yourself, your family, your friends. But if you're in that bandwidth, I don't think you need to do that. And based on what the psychologists are starting to say, CBT and mindfulness and stuff like that seems to be a lot more effective than taking drugs. And quite frankly, I believe that because we're all addicts. Our brains are basically hooked on dopamine, serotonin, whatever it happens to be, and they're all, sort of, as we have replacements for that are opioids, etc., that we basically hook in or latch into the same positions, and it has that addictive effect. Basically, our brains, if you're a human being, you're a junkie. In some manner, shape or form. A natural one, you produce the chemicals yourself, but you are a junkie. And for ADHD, you might use recreational drugs of some manner, shape or form, or the actual ones that are prescribed. But the ones that are prescribed are in the opioid group, and they can, quite frankly, kill you. And they can be addictive, and they can have nasty side effects. My mother, she was a nurse, didn't want that for me, and basically I never got any. It's that simple until I was an adult. And I still didn't think they made that much of a difference by that time because I was coping with it and dealing with it, knew that I had ADHD, and I dealt with it. So my question is are the different disorders that we have actually nature's mutations, upgrades? We don't necessarily see them as such. We keep looking at our the things that we have when it's to do with the brain or to do with what we call mental health, has just been something negative. It's one of our cognitive biases as well. We look for the negative stuff, and you've got a pile like that. If it's something positive, it's like, oh yeah, and you've got hyperfocus. That's pretty fucking amazing. But we tend always look for the negative, and we'll believe that more often than not. And our doctors seem to do that. But the thing is that doctors, if it comes, so for example, another question to you, have you ever been in a life-threatening situation where you get choices from a doctor? If you haven't, go ask somebody that maybe has an older member of the family where they've had to make legal decisions for that person. The doctors will not take that decision off your hands. You've got to do that yourself. And you've got to understand the options that they give you, and very often the options are pretty crap. So if that's the case, then my question is, we've got, I think, the upgrades that the scientists are looking for are already in place. It's just we call them diseases, or the like, when it's to do with the brain, because we can't see it. It's not on the outside. But they have superpowers. So all those, the creative and famous people that have been artists, musicians, mathematicians, they had disorders. So just imagine if we'd got to the point where we're getting close to now, where we can choose to have children where they don't have those disorders. They know the genes, and they just say, right, get rid of them. We don't want that. What the world would have lost if that hadn't occurred, if that person hadn't had that, we call a disorder. So that's a change to the operating system. Our brains function differently. So the question I'm asking you is, would you say, okay, I don't want ADHD? In my particular case, it's part of who I am. And I'd turn it on its head and say, would my mother have not had me if she had the choice? If she had said, okay, they're going to have ADHD, or you're going to have bipolar disorder? Do you love your child less? And if they're going to have an amazing life, if they pick the right, if they go in the right direction, and you never know that anywhere with a normal child or any other child that you have. But if they can look after themselves, what we are taking away from the human race if you decide not to have those type of people? What do you end up with? Because those type of people are the different thinkers, the different looking at a situation differently, from a different angle, from a different perspective. And also then maybe, for example, standing up and just shouting, no, that's wrong, whereas the others just keep quiet. So there you go. That's my thought for the evening. That is episode 28 done. As always, this is sponsored by Leaders Travel TV. I would like to thank you for listening, and have a plan, be fun, foster wisdom wherever you see it. And have a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening, or even a good night, depending on wherever you are. And I'm certainly now going to have a good night. See you tomorrow.